Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. London photographer George Georgiou was introduced to photography when he took a course at school as an extra subject. After teaching photography part-time, he gradually worked his way to a point where he could commit to longer-term projects. These entailed living and working for the next decade in the Balkans, Turkey, Greece, producing material for a book he called Faultlines. Returning to London, he focused on the lives of ordinary people and their environment, seen through the windows of the famous red London bus. More recently, he turned his eye on a particularly American phenomenon, the parade. This truly fascinating series reveals sometimes small, sometimes large groups standing close together in public spaces, waiting for the parade to pass by. Waiting. Some are family, friends, some complete strangers. In microcosm, an America of multiple identities. The relationship of the individual in a community and visible and invisible fault lines is the subject of this seminar today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome George Georgiou.
How do I control the pictures? How do I flick between the images? So I'm just waiting on a controller, but I'm going to show you three bodies of work, and it's just three books that I've produced. And they all have a kind of common thread through them in that it's the way I look at public space, community, and the individual. And each book is very different in its subject matter and its form. The first body is Faultlines, Turkey East-West. This book came out in 2010, but I was living in Istanbul and Turkey from 2003 to 2008. I do need something to flick through the pictures. Okay. So I spent, just preceding this, me and my wife, the photographer Vanessa Winship, we had moved away from England and moved to Belgrade in Serbia, where we spent a year pretty much around the time that Milosevic has fallen. And then we moved to Greece, and finally we ended up in Turkey. And originally, at that time, there was a lot of talk about Turkey joining the EU. So I kind of started to think about the borders of Turkey, and I started to crisscross the country. And our move into Istanbul coincided with Tayyip Erdogan coming into power. So he became Prime Minister in the very same year. And as I was traveling through Turkey on numerous trips, going right over to the eastern borders with Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Armenia and Georgia. On these kind of long journeys, I started to see what was the beginning of a new development through the housing agency of Toki. So they started to build modern structures right across the country and started to modernize at an incredible speed. So this is a complex that I think the previous village had been destroyed through flooding, and so they built this new structures, new village in the kind of middle of this little valley, and I I was driving past and only just caught a glimpse of the minaret of the mosque, and I stopped the car and looked down and found this incredible small village. And it's roughly around this time that I was listening to a BBC radio report, which was it was about the tenements of or the new high rises of Glasgow, and they had archive interviews from the 60s when they would knock down the tenements in Glasgow, and people were being interviewed about the new high-rise buildings that they were going to be living in, and how happy people were to have an indoor toilet and a modern kitchen. And the reason they were playing the archives is that they were now knocking down the high-rises they built in the 60s because of the huge amount of kind of problems that they caused. And so, I began to kind of question this idea of what is being built in the name of people and what that does to community. In Turkey, people seem to really like to be out on the street. They're very close to each other. And so much activity goes on ground level. And I start to kind of, I suppose I was questioning what happens when you're on the 16th floor of a building, especially I think for some of the, especially for women, I think, where they often would come down together and clean carpets at the same time of the year outside as a communal thing. And so do you get to know your neighbour? Will you know? And then, in a sense, I suppose I was looking towards this alienating landscape, what it will do to community. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's kind of difficult to judge in terms of, I know what happened in Britain and many of the other Western countries. I don't know how it will play out in places like Turkey and here, where we are now. So with Turkey being on this crossroads of what we call East and West, I kind of started to think, what do these concepts mean? What is East? What is West? And does West mean modern? Does it, it's kind of a concepts that constantly kind of thrown around, but I don't think we really actually think about what they mean. And where is West? Where, if you're coming from I don't know, Delhi, what's west to you? What's east to you? If you're coming from Britain, what's west to you? What's east to you? Where we might see an alienating landscape. I remember showing these pictures in Lagos, and they were kind of saying, "Oh, I wish Lagos was like this." So it's kind of perceptions change from place to place. And with all the work, I tried to kind of work on two levels. One is a kind of global level, which is this kind of architectural building, what's been built for us. And on the second level, it's the kind of the local level, which sometimes in a book is harder for people to understand if you don't know a lot about the country. And it's kind of introducing some of the dynamics and politics that are going on. There's a lot of dualities going on in Turkey. There's between modernity and tradition, secularism and Islam, democracy and repression, and they often work in very contradictory combinations. I mean, for me, this kind of image was really important because my family are from Cyprus, so this is an aeroplane that kind of is commemorates the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And my family are Greek. But also for me, what was kind of interesting was with this image is that, you have a very kind of modern secular girl on a bicycle. And one of the contradictions you find in Turkey is that often the military support the secular society and support the military. And that was one of the big issues during that time in terms of them joining the EU, was that the military kind of weren't accountable to the politicians. And the book ends with, I don't know, I think there's 6 pages of these portraits in Taksim Square. So this is maybe 4 or 5 years before the protests in Taksim Square. And what I found really interesting was that in the modernization that was happening, one of the things that the AKP government did was they doubled the number of universities. And I kind of felt that this was really interesting because you have a lot of people moving to the cities, their children are being educated. I think for most young people, it's your duty not to be like your parents. And I wanted to end on a sort of a collection of images of hope, to see their kind of individual characters. It was almost like I was watching a fashion show. And I kind of felt that the kind of young would be the hope of Turkey, and they would be the ones that would kind of fight any kind of repression. And in fact, they did 5 years later, but unfortunately, it wasn't successful. But the actual final image is an image that I took in, I've forgotten now, but it's in the southeast, Mardin. And this is a celebration, or they're practicing for the celebration of Ataturk Day, which is also Youth Day. And this is kind of, it's almost like the children have to it's kind of practice military sort of procession, but these children are Kurds. And so I love the way that there's no kind of real strict discipline. They're all kind of standing in their own individual ways. Okay. So it's a long time since I've talked about this work, so it's kind of like I'm just making it up as I go along a little bit because it must be close to 10 years ago or something. But again, it was the beginning of me starting to think about what community is going to look like and how that might develop. So after I left London and returned to. I left Turkey and returned to London, which is my home city, the city I was born in, and it was incredible the amount of change that had happened in London in those kind of 8 to 10 years. It's had the biggest migration in its history coming into Britain, mostly not just from the east of Europe, but kind of across the world. I mean, my parents came in from Cyprus, so usually, I mean, before I left, the majority of migrant families had come from the colonies, and now it's pretty much everywhere in the world. And so there's this huge influx. So I was kind of really fascinated by this. And this work was originally my working title was Migrations. And the reason I was thinking about migrations was, again, we were having a lot of migration, people photographing, people crossing the seas into Greece, into Italy. But for me, what was kind of interesting is the kind of the last stop, the promised land. This is where you're trying to get. And I'm not so sure whether they are such promised lands. So I'm going to play, and also from this point, the first book I made was kind of co-published in 4 languages by 4 publishers. But with this work and the next work, I kind of decided that I wanted to I kind of turned down publishers because I wanted to self-publish because I had particular ways I saw the work and how it would work. And often publishers are not willing to do what I want them to do. So I kind of thought it'd be easier to crowdfund the books and have them printed exactly as I want them. And for me, this work, it's not really, it's best seen as a book, and I exhibit the book. And I'll show you a picture at the end. So I've got a video that I'm going to play, which is my crowdfunding campaign. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to reintroduce myself again in this, and again later.
My name's George Georgiou, a photographer born and raised in London. In 2008, I returned to London, having lived away for a number of years. I instantly started working on Last Stop, and it represents 5 years of work. Last stop was photographed across the whole city through the windows of London's double-decker buses. Although London has always been a dynamic city with a changing demographic, I was surprised by the speed of change. London has experienced its largest foreign migration in history. The economy had boomed, but the wealth gap has increased. Somehow, all this diversity has found a way to coexist. This migration was one of the first motivating factors for making this project. The idea of London as the promised land, the last stop. But this migration in the city applies to us all. It is this constant movement and sharing of space that fascinates me. As a young teenager, during the school holidays, my friends and I would wander around the city, jumping on and off random buses. We would go to places we had no reason to visit and use London like a massive playground. In many ways, what I'm doing now is not too dissimilar, taking random buses and getting lost across the city. The double-decker buses allowed me to frame the city, to give it sense. The lower level is very close to street photography. I'm almost touching the people on the street. The upper deck allows me the distance to capture the layers of the urban landscape. Another observation is how people use public space in a big city, that sense of invisibility. By sitting behind the window, I also become invisible, a little bit like the thousands of CCTV cameras that track our movements. As a photographer, I wanted the challenge of not having full control, taking whatever free seat there was next to the window, only being able to photograph what was within reach of my static position in front of me, just a fleeting glance. Nonetheless, my photography is not detached. I try to capture and understand the emotional content of London's everyday movements, rhythms and rituals. I am part of this. It is also my movement, my community, my home. The book I am making is a double-sided concertina and is integral to the concept of the whole work. The essence of the project is that you might take the same route every day, but what you see, the ebb and flow on the streets, takes on a random nature. To capture this flow, the concertina allows the feel of a bus journey, but more importantly, it gives the viewer the opportunity to create their own journeys by spreading the book out and combining different images together, allowing for multiple readings. By supporting this book, you will be allowing another view to exist of contemporary London, a London that is complex, diverse and layered, where history has conspired to make it the most multicultural city in the world.
So that was my homemade dummy of the book. And when I showed publishers, there was one big publisher that wanted to do this book, but they were going to make it on such flimsy paper that instantly it would just break. So like I say, I ended up crowdfunding the book. And I'm going to just go through the beginning of the book. There's only really, I think, 2 images in the book that are very recognizably London to everyone, which is kind of this image and one other. And I wanted to, this is the first image in the book, and I wanted to kind of establish that you're looking through a window. And so it's the only one where you have rain on the window. I always used to try to keep the camera as close to the glass as possible, so I didn't want to play with the aesthetics of the color and the distortion that you get through the glass, because for me the actual focuses on the movement of the people and the interactions of the people. And from here, I go into a series of frames, which is it's an exchange of looks. So I want to make it quite clear that this is a kind of series of gazes. And in one part, it's the voyeuristic nature of a city, and they're also kind of making reference to the fact that the cities are covered in surveillance cameras. So originally, this work kind of stemmed from another project that I did in Ukraine, where I'd been invited to Ukraine to do a talk, generously by the World Press, and and I think the British Council. So the money they gave me kind of gave me enough time to kind of travel through Ukraine. This is after just after the Orange Revolution. And having lived in Serbia, I didn't want to kind of focus on Kiev, because I think Kiev doesn't really tell you what's happening after these kind of revolutions. And I knew that after these revolutions, not a lot changes. The process is incredibly slow, having lived in Serbia. So I decided to travel through the country on trains and buses and trams. And I was kind of photographing not just through the window, but at this kind of stops. And I kind of made this observation of how Ukrainians would hold themselves. And they had a very kind of strong kind of feel of being very internal and distant from one another, almost like they were in their own headspace. So I kind of started to think about this, and I thought, oh, I wonder what it would be like if I went to, did this in Istanbul. Similar kind of weather conditions, and how would they be? And it was very interesting, because in Istanbul they were completely, the way they hold themselves is completely different, because people like to be very close together, and they're constantly looking and moving. So I was thinking, oh, this could be an interesting way culturally to kind of look at different countries. But when I started to work in London, let's see if I've got and this is, actually, I was still living in Turkey, and I'd just gone back for a holiday. And I thought, oh, let's see what's going to happen in London. And this is one of the first photographs I took. And after taking this picture, I really changed all my plans, because actually there was a much more interesting story that maybe talks about all cities. And that is how we perceive each other in cities. And so partly I suppose I kind of describe it as that we're all the time, as we move through the city, we are seeing mini soap operas being played out, and we make up our own story to them because we're at a certain distance to them. And I kind of think it's very similar to when we're on a motorway and you see a car crash, and as you come up to the car crash, you slow down and you rubberneck. And I think living in a city, whatever city, is kind of we're in a series of rubbernecking situations continuously. And the length of the project was really based around how many of these little scenarios I could get to through, where I would be happy with what I ended up having, because there's obviously a lot of other things about London and so on in the book. So it was this kind of just waiting for these moments. For me, it's like, are they, we don't really know who this couple are. It's, but are they lovers? Are they a married couple? And so it's just a question of kind of finding these kind of scenarios. And I must admit, I loved the fixed position of sitting in a seat and just being able to photograph just what was in front of you. And you would often see things just a little along the way, and you couldn't take the picture. And I love the fact that I could let go of missing images, and that's mainly because I think there's always images out there, and especially as I'm kind of trying to start to focus on what's very familiar to us all, and trying to see what's in our faces every day, and trying to make sense of that. I mean, for me, this was kind of an extraordinary exchange, because it's very unlikely that you see an older white woman in this kind of communication, and then there's that kind of cigarette exchange, and who's giving who's approached to. And for me, this is a kind of another classic situation you might see in the street. You might see an argument between a couple, and you don't know, are they husband and wife? Should I intercept, or is it, it could be a complete two strangers having an argument, and we're always kind of in these kind of dilemmas of when we see things in the streets. When you start to look at a space very, very carefully, there are so many ways that you can create a body of work. So in London, I could have done it as a timeline. Very early in the morning, it's basically new migrants moving to clean shops and so on, offices and so on. Then you get the regular population of Britain, which is kind of European, Indian, West Indian, the kind of populations that have been in Britain the longest. During the day, you tend again to get kind of young, you get mothers, migrant mothers. You don't hear so much English. They're kind of struggling with shopping and babies and so on. They don't have cars at this point. Then you get this reversal of people going home, and then at night, it again becomes very white and European to an extent, because that's the people with money going out to eat, drink, clubs, and so on. But another way, and what I find fascinating in a place like London, which is kind of different to quite a lot of cities, is how we share space. Because I think the way London is kind of structured is that you have very rich with very poor in very close proximity to each other. So we had the Grenfell Tower disaster, where the tower burnt, and on that same street you have houses that are 8-10 million pounds, and so. And it was the same in my neighbourhood. When I look at my neighbourhood, we have a kind of a mix of kind of younger professionals. We have a Turkish and Kurdish community. We have a Hasidic Jewish community. And the way people use the space is that they kind of almost use it at different times. So in the daytime, the community outside is really very Turkic and very Hasidic. At night, it becomes very white as people are at the bars and restaurants. The same at the weekend, it becomes much more white. But even so, in the book, I have these two images, but you open the book up and you end up they're actually sharing the same space. So it almost looks like you're in two different places, two different worlds. So this is kind of final book, and I spent a long time editing the book, but the reason I made it into a concertina is that the viewer can re-edit it. So because I was thinking, how do you give away your role as an editor, and also because it's the book is kind of, it could be a journey, and the idea that you go on the same journey every day, but what you see on the streets is constantly changing. So I kind of felt that, having the concertina was really crucial to this concept of being able to kind of, completely re-edit the book. And when I first started showing this work, exhibiting this work, it was with prints. And I don't know, there was this kind of light bulb moment where, because for me, the book is the artwork. And it's infinitely better to exhibit the book. You know, you can play one or two larger images. It's very kind of flexible because you can use any space. It's super cheap to transport because I just need 2 books and a carrier bag. So the concept of the book for me is really it's kind of really crucial for how the work lives on. Exhibitions are fabulous, but you know, we're here for 1 week and then it's gone. Okay, now I'm going to move on to American parades. And this work was made over a year, but I would say that it was kind of 5 years in the making. And when I say it's 5 years in the making, it's kind of, I spent 5 years thinking about what I was going to do in the States. And in 2011, I went to the States with Vanessa. And we were both originally going to shoot, but Vanessa had won the Cartier-Bresson Prize and had to make a book on, she had to have a book done in a year and an exhibition. And the States was very new to us. So it's kind of the first trip I was kind of shooting, but I kind of felt as it's a new, because we always work in the same spaces, the same places, but make very different work. But because it was new to us, I kind of felt that I didn't really want to influence how Vanessa would see, because she has a very particular way of seeing, but we do like the same imagery when we see something. So it's, you know, I had to kind of, and it sounds very generous, but it's not. I stepped back and stopped photographing for all those trips we did to the States. But actually, what I was doing was looking, and I really needed the time to look, because I think, I don't know, I think a lot of Europeans sometimes kind of have the same feeling. When you go to the States, you see a lot of injustices that make you angry in the way the society is kind of structured. And I had maybe too much anger to be able to make an interesting body of work. And the subject that I was really fascinated by was the politics of the road. And this was going to be the kind of the work that I was going to make. And I kind of started to explore how the road has kind of created the society it has, the way it divides. And I did kind of work on little parts of that. So in 2016, I kind of thought, okay, I've got to go to the States, it's now or never. I'm going to try and see if I can work on this story on the politics of the road. And one of the things I'd been doing while I was, one of the things I was looking at was Martin Luther King boulevards. And I flew into LA, and it happened to be 3 days after I arrived. There was a Martin Luther King parade on Long Beach. And it had been one of the roads I'd been to in the past. And I stopped the car, and what you see now, the very first frame I made from that parade was what you see in the book. It was kind of, and it wasn't like it just come to me, because I had photographed something in a similar style earlier at Trayvon Martin parade, because when Vanessa was working, the whole Trayvon Martin case was breaking. And so we'd actually gone to Miami, where he was from, for a Trayvon Martin demonstration that his family had come out. And it was, I think it wasn't Martin Luther King Day, but it was, I think, maybe the day that he died. And they were celebrating, they had a procession at that, but it was mostly a kind of demonstration for Trayvon Martin. And very interestingly, very few white people at that time. So it's amazing to see how many white people are coming out on with the Black Lives Matter now, 10 years on. So I'm going to play you the Kickstarter that I did. It kind of explains what I'm trying to do maybe better than I am here. Again, I'm going to be introducing myself, sorry.
My name is George Georgiou. I'm a British photographer and I'd like to introduce my new book, Americans Parade. I have been to the US several times over the years, and outside of the biggest cities I would see very little street life and have no reason to stop. I would only know the place by its reputation. It was like the local community was invisible. The idea for the work came about when I went to a Martin Luther King parade in a neighbourhood I'd been to before. Unlike my first visit, when the streets were empty, the streets were alive, full of people, families, movement and sound. A complex community was suddenly visible. In 2016, I decided to crisscross the country, looking for parades that covered many of the different American demographics. The New York Times magazine liked the idea and supported me throughout, publishing the work on the weekend of Donald Trump's inauguration. Throughout the year, I visited 26 parades in 24 cities across 14 states. From huge crowds in New York or Laredo, Texas, to small family groups in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Ripley, West Virginia. From the very first parade, my visual approach was simple and deliberate. Moving alongside the parade, I would follow the route, waiting for a clear view to photograph a section of the crowd on the other side. I would look at the landscape and the overall composition, at groups that caught my attention and fleeting moments, but I also embraced the generosity of the camera, its ability to record and freeze more than I can register. The crowd gives the photograph that element of chance to create itself. The details become important, a sea of faces, expressions, postures, gestures, a look, a touch, alongside fashions and social behaviour and interactions. A narrative full of complexities and ambiguities, like a series of modern-day tableaus. A parade of Americans, one after the other, from one community to the next, building up a picture of Americans in 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected, a year when America's divisions have never been more pronounced. And although much of America is segregated by race or income, and this difference is exploited as a means to polarize and divide, it's far too simple to define a community through this very narrow gauge. I have attempted to create a group portrait of multiple identities where people stand together in the company of strangers. I have thought long and hard about how best to present this work in book form. I am again collaborating with printer Ufuk Şahin and his team at MAS in Istanbul. The biggest challenge has been maximising the size of each image without making a book that is oversized and unmanageable. We knew the images had to go across the double page. To overcome problems with the gutter, MAS has perfected a lay-flat binding where each image is printed whole and glued back to back. This allows for each image to have no interference and to lay completely flat.
And although I kind of spent a huge amount of effort making this book, actually this work is actually best seen at large scale, like you see it here. I mean, in fact, this is these prints are probably the smallest prints I've had made of this work, because everyone that's exhibited so far tends to go for around 3 meters an image, so you're really kind of absorbed in the work. But I did still want to have this book, and trying to find the right size where it doesn't become too cumbersome led to this kind of experimenting with this technique. So this was actually the first photograph that I took. So, you know, the demographics of the states and its segregation to me was really important, but how do you talk about that in a friendly kind of way in terms of the imagery? And because And this is Long Beach. So this would have been, it's Martin Luther King Boulevard. This would have been a completely black African-American neighborhood. But now you have an influx of new migrants who are moving into, in effect, what are some of the cheapest neighborhoods to move into. So you have this very interesting mix of Asians, Hispanic, Latinos, and African Americans. So when I took this picture, I kind of realized that this was kind of the way for me to move forward with this kind of project. This was a day later, because in LA, I think Long Beach had a Martin Luther King parade a day early because they didn't want to compete with LA. So I had these two parades right at the beginning. And for me, the American landscape is really important. I mean, I know a lot about American photography. I think when I first started to study photography in Britain, this is way before the internet, the only way you could really see books was through being at a college, and our libraries were amazing, and we had a lot of the work we had was from American photographers. So then I kind of moved to, this is in, I think it might be Brownsville or Laredo, but it's right on the Texas-Mexican border. It's one of the 5 most segregated towns in the US, 96% Hispanic. And I'm not sure if it's, that I think they might be celebrating the President's Day. So what I would do is kind of, from my home in England, I would look for parades in the States, and then when I found something that sounded a little bit interesting, I would go onto YouTube, try to find little videos that people taking part in the parade have posted, just to get an idea of demographics, get an idea of the place. And I really wanted to do a kind of cross-section of the States. So it was, I mean, partly it's, you know, hoping that when you get to whatever parade, because it's a long way to travel, that it would kind of live up to your expectations. And when I was kind of thinking of when I was sort of thinking of the politics of the road, I was kind of thinking how we kind of perceive places. And quite often, you're driving through these neighborhoods. You don't actually stop to interact with people. So you're seeing it through a window or through a TV screen. And I kind of think one of the things that I kind of like about this is that what you're looking at are families. However negative the press is of an area, and however high an area might have in terms of a crime rate, that crime rate is really only a very small percentage of people, because most people are just like everybody else. They're families just trying to get on. And I think this was a great opportunity to kind of show families together. This is a college town. And what I kind of found fascinating, and the reason, I mean, my working title for a long time was In the Company of Strangers, because again, it's these communities are invisible, because I would drive through the streets of Americas, you know, outside of New York and Chicago and San Francisco and a couple of others, and the streets are empty. Everyone is in a car. And so you don't know, you don't see the community, it's invisible to you. And suddenly these streets would fill up. Interestingly, they would fill up just before the parade, and they were empty like by 15 minutes after the parade, the streets would be empty again. But I was starting to think about, you know, we're kind of, in many ways, we're more connected than ever in terms of social media and our telephones, and we're constantly kind of buzzing, but that connection in that cloud, it's not kind of replicating itself in the physical world, in that we're kind of becoming more and more distant. And I think that's going to get worse, because I think the economics of the world is shifting, where we're not going to have the same kind of work as before. I mean, COVID was an amazing example of how that the shift now to home working, because it's possible, we've seen it can work. You don't need to go into an office. So that disconnect is going to grow and grow. And I kind of feel that people were together here, but they're also not together, It's it is this kind of group of individuals. But this is an example of this kind of the level of segregation in the States. This image and the next image were shot on the same day in New Orleans. This Mardi Gras was going through the neighborhood of Algiers, and when I kind of saw it was going through Algiers, it's kind of a birthplace of jazz. It's famous for its music and its old clubs and so on. I had this kind of image that this African-American crew were going to go through this area. I don't know, I thought it was going to be like Notting Hill, in England, where people, a lot of white people will come because it's like, oh, wow, it's going through this really interesting neighborhood. But I think I must have seen 6 white faces the whole time I was there. And the starkness of the floor, because they throw beads out, and you'll see it nicely illustrated in the next image. And this is going through the white neighborhood, maybe 3 hours later. And the abundance and the rubbish on the floor and the huge number of beads they have, and the privilege of being able to set up steps with chairs on them outside your house. And what I found really interesting, and which surprised me, I think the thing that really surprised me was in the states of Kentucky and West Virginia, the states that have the kind of reputation of being the redneck states, I actually saw more racial mixing than anywhere else in the states. And I was drawn to this image particularly because I like the reversal of the white man holding the baby in a mixed relationship instead of the usual representation of a white woman and an African man. And this is in Central Park, and I find this really fascinates me as well, because you have the self-segregation of white and Asian on the hill and African Americans at the bottom. And this is the hardest population in the States to capture, and not just in the States, but anywhere in the world. This is the ultra-rich. And this is during Macy's Thanksgiving. And I don't know if people have ever been to Macy's Thanksgiving, but the streets of New York are ram-packed. And this is on, I think it might be called South Central. So you have a Trump building just a little bit further, and it's overlooking Central Park. I don't know if it's south or north, but it's... and I love the fact that she's outside the apartment block that she lives in. Obviously, the janitor's got the step ladders, so she has a nice vantage point. Not that she needs to be high up, because there's no one in her space. And I love the fact that you cannot work out her age. She's just reeking of wealth and class. You know, the trousers, the face is, she's kind of timeless. Yeah. And that's just one of the couple of exhibitions how everyone seems to go for the supersize imagery. And that's it. Thank you.